Hi everyone, and welcome back to another Mule Made Easy tutorial. My name is Joshua Ernie, and today we're going to be going over part 1 of a 2-part tutorial covering the Java module in Mule 4. The Java module in Mule 4 has 4 different operations. There's new, which can create a new instance of a class. There's invoke, which you can use to invoke methods on a class. Invoke static, which you can use to invoke static methods on a class, and validate type, which it does exactly what it sounds like. It validates the type of an object. In part 1, we're going to be going over new and invoke, and in another video for part 2, we'll be going over invoke static and validate type. Let's get into it. So we're going to demo new and invoke for you using the tripler.java class. If we look at this real quick, it has a single field, private int called a. We have our default constructor here. We have 2 public methods, one called triple, which returns int, and that does exactly what you probably think it does. It takes a and multiplies it by 3 and returns the result of that operation. And then we have set a, which we use to set the value of a, and we pass in an int for that. So to demo this, the first thing we want to do is create a new instance of tripler. And what we can do to do that is come over to our palette, type in new. We'll drag this over to the canvas in our flow. I'm going to go ahead and give this a better name. I'm going to call it tripler, just to be a little more descriptive. We are using the default constructor, so we don't have any arguments here, but I'll show you how to pass in arguments to a method or a constructor later in the tutorial. For class, we need to specify the fully qualified path name for the class that we want to use, fully qualified class name for the class that we want to use. For us, that's com.mme.api.tripler. And for our constructor, since it's just the default constructor, that's tripler, and then open and close parentheses since we're not providing any arguments. Again, you have to do things a little bit differently when you're providing arguments, and we'll show that later in the tutorial. Let's go into the advanced tab and set this to an output variable. We'll call that variable tripler. Go ahead and save that. And what I'd like to do now is just go ahead and log that instance to make sure we're getting the correct instance. So new instance of tripler is vars tripler. All right. Let's go ahead and give this a better name too, actually. Logger for tripler instance. Okay. So what we want to do next is, so right now we kind of have this empty tripler class. It doesn't have its a field set. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll use invoke on the set a method in order to accomplish that. So we'll come over here, search for invoke, we'll drag that over. So this one's a little bit different in terms of inputs to what we saw with new. In this case, we need to specify what instance we're calling the method on. So for this, you just give it the variable that is storing the instance of the class. In this case, it's tripler. So we'll go ahead and close those brackets. We'll come back to args in a second. For a class, it's the same as before. So I'm just going to go in here and copy that and paste that in there. And for the method, we want set a. Now, this is Mule Made Easy tip number 1. You need to remember to set the argument types when you're telling the invoke or the new operation how to, or what method to use or what constructor to use. In this case, is int. And the reason you have to do that is because in Java, you can use method overloading, where you have 2 methods that have the same name, but take in different argument types. For example, you could have a method called print that takes in a string and prints out the string to the console, but you could also have a method called print in the same class that takes in an integer and prints out that integer as a string. So when you specify the argument types for the method, you allow the component to determine what method to use in the case that you have overloaded methods on that class. All right, so to set args, we use our typical pound sign, open brackets, but here we'll just use a map or a Java object, or excuse me, a JavaScript object is what it looks more like. So open and close the curly braces, and we're setting A, so we'll set that to 1. So notice the syntax there. We're basically just providing a set of key value pairs where the key is the name of the argument and the value is whatever we want to pass in for that argument. We're not going to use the advanced tab to set this to a variable because all it's doing is directly modifying the data contained within the class, and there's no output for that because set A returns void. All right, so the next thing we want to do is actually invoke that tripler method. So I'm going to bring invoke over here. Actually, excuse me, I want to give this a better name so we can see what's going on. We'll call that set A. And before I forget here, we'll call this one triple. Instance is the same thing as before. We want vars .tripler. For the class, I'm just going to copy that in again. And for the method, this time we actually want triple. And if you remember, triple doesn't take in any arguments, but it does return an int. So we want to go into the advanced tab, and let's just go ahead and set this to result. So we'll go ahead and save that. And the last thing I want to do here is log the result. The result of triple was, and we'll do vars dot result. All right, so let's go ahead and let me see. I have a listener here. This is set up on instance. I'm actually just going to change this to test. I believe this is listening on 8081. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and spin up this application and get a Postman application running, and we'll use that to call the app, and we'll see what the logs output and see if we got what we expected. So now that this is deployed, I'm going to go ahead and trigger this with Postman off screen. We'll see the logs pop up. So looks like we got an error here. Let's check out our logs. The first info log, new instance of tripler is exactly, oh, sorry about that. This is exactly what we wanted. So far so good. However, it looks like when we get to, let's see what the element XML was, Java invoke set A. So when we get to set A, we get this error. Fail to invoke method set A. In our tripler class with arguments integer A, it expected arguments are int arg0. So this was actually expected. The reason it's doing this is because by default, you actually cannot specify your arguments by their name. By default, you just specify them as arg0, arg1, arg2, etc. So let's go into the Mule documentation real quick and see what it says about this. So there's a little info block right here. When configuring the method arguments and the args parameter, the keys for the map will identify which parameter to invoke. To reference the parameters by name, you have to use the parameters compiler flag. So that's what we would like to do. If I go over here and click this, however, I've gone through this documentation before on the Oracle Java site, and it doesn't really give a lot of, I didn't really find any good information about how to pass in the parameters compiler flag. However, Apache Maven has a plugin called the Maven compiler plugin, and we can actually use that to pass compiler arguments. And I will share this link in the description of the video, so check that out when you're trying to set this up. So what we're going to do here is just highlight everything in this plugin tag. We'll go back to our any.7, and we're going to open up the pom.xml. So we need to put this in within the build plugins section. So We'll hit enter there. We'll paste that. I'm going to format this using Command-Shift-F. If you have a Windows or a Linux machine, that'll be Control-Shift-F, I believe. So we're going to go ahead and delete this line, and we needed to pass in parameters, so we'll say parameters here. And we'll go ahead and save that. And let's go ahead and come back here. We'll stop this, and we'll launch this one more time and give it another shot. All right, so this is deployed successfully again. Let's kick this off and see if that plugin that we added made any difference. All right, so it looks like we didn't get an error there, which is great. And the result of triple was 3, which is exactly what we expected, right? We passed in 1, the tripler multiplied it by 3, and gave us 3 back. So getting around that issue is going to be our Mule Made Easy tip number 2. Just remember that when you're trying to specify the arguments that you pass to the invoke or invoke static or new operations, when you're trying to do that by name, you need to make sure that you have this plugin and you're passing in the parameters arg to the compiler, or else it's going to give you that error saying you need to have it set as arg0, arg1, etc. And I just want to go back one more time, just in case you don't want to specify your arguments by name. I don't see why you would, quite frankly, because it's just so much more clear, in my opinion, when you specify the names. But let's go ahead and, if we set this to arg0 and we took out that plugin from the POM XML, let's see what would happen. All right, so we're going to come back here. I think this will, yep, this will just reboot. And let's go, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off screen. That's because it rebooted with the POM still in there. The POM still had the Maven compiler plugin when the application rebooted. So let's go ahead and spin this up one more time. So just remember here in set A, I have changed specifying the arguments by name to specifying them as arg0 or arg1, basically what it's expecting if we did not have the Maven compiler plugin in our pom.xml. So if we look at the console, this should be deployed. Let's go ahead and run this real quick. And if we scroll over here, you'll see that we get the same output. So kind of a tomato situation, depends on what you want to do. Both work, although I would highly encourage you to specify the parameters option for the compiler flags. It just makes your code that much readable. If this thing wasn't A and it was something like tax code, it would make so much more sense if it was tax code instead of arg0. In conclusion, this was part 1 of a 2-part tutorial going over the Java module in Mule 4. We went over new, which we use to create a new instance of a class, and invoke, which we use to invoke a method on a class. We went over 2 Mule Made Easy tips. The first one, making sure that you specify the argument types when you're specifying a constructor or a method. And 2, if you want to supply arguments by name, which I highly recommend that you do, you want to add the Maven compiler plugin to your POM XML and make sure you add the parameters flag. So that wraps up today's video. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or recommendations for future content, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'll make sure I post the link that I told you about earlier for the Maven compiler plugin and a link to the code on GitHub as well. If you like the content, feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you next time.